Here's something that doesn't make sense. In 1177 BC, the world ended. Not the whole world, just the only world that mattered to people back then, the Bronze Age. The first time humans built something we'd recognize as civilization. Cities with stone walls, palaces with running water, ships that crossed the sea carrying olive oil and copper and wine, a network of trade that stretched from Greece to Egypt to Mesopotamia, kings who wrote letters to each other, scribes who kept records, artists who painted fresco, and then it all stopped. Not slowly, not gradually, fast. 40 cities destroyed in 50 years. Some burned, some abandoned, some just empty. The great powers collapsed. The Hittite Empire vanished completely. Mycenaean Greece went dark. The Egyptian Empire barely survived. Cities along the coast of what's now Turkey and Syria and Lebanon were wiped out. Trade networks that had worked for centuries broke apart. Writing disappeared in some places. People forgot how to read. The population dropped by maybe 75% in some regions. Archaeologists call it the Bronze Age collapse. The name makes it sound academic, distant. But here's what it really was. Imagine if every major city in North America, and Europe just stopped working all at once. Governments gone, trade stopped, no more books being written, no more art being made, most people dead or scattered. The survivors living in small villages, forgetting most of what their grandparents knew. That's what happened in 1177 BC. And nobody knows why. There are theories. Earthquakes, drought, invaders called the Sea Peoples, economic collapse, systems. Theory, climate change, disease, probably all of it at once. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. It took 3,000 years to build that world. Bronze Age civilization started around 3,300 BC. Slowly, carefully, humans figured out how to live in cities, how to write, how to make bronze, how to sail ships across open water, how to organize kingdoms, how to keep thousands of people fed. 3,000 years of progress, gone in 50. The survivors kept living. They had children. They farmed. They remembered some things. Stories about the old days when there were palaces and kings. Stories that would eventually become the Iliad and the Odyssey. But the world they knew was over. And it stayed over for 400 years. Historians call it the Greek Dark Ages. No writing, no cities, no traditional. Just villages and oral tradition and the slow work of forgetting. What could destroy everything in 50 years? Before 1177 BC, the world worked, not the whole world. Most humans still lived in small groups, hunting, gathering, farming tiny plots of land. But around the Mediterranean, something bigger had emerged. The Bronze Age kingdoms. Let me show you what that world looked like. Start in Egypt. The new kingdom is at its peak. Ramesses III sits on the throne. His empire stretches from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north. Memphis has maybe 30,000 people. Thebes has even more. These aren't villages. They're cities with stone temples and markets and workshops where craftsmen make jewelry and furniture and weapons. Egyptian ships sail to Byblo in Lebanon. They bring back cedar wood, the best wood in the world for building. They trade grain and gold and linen. The ships come back loaded, now move north to the Hittite Empire. Their capital is Hattusa, in what's now Turkey. The city covers 400 acres, stone walls 20 feet thick, 5 temples, a palace complex with its own water system, archives full of clay tablets, treaties, letters, records of tribute. The Hittite king calls himself Great King. He writes to other great kings, the pharaoh in Egypt, the king of Assyria, the king of Babylon. They call each other brother. They arrange marriages. They trade gifts. They complain when the gifts aren't good enough. One letter, survives. The Hittite king writes to the pharaoh. He's annoyed. The gold statues Egypt sent weren't solid gold, just gold-plated wood. He can tell because his craftsman checked. He wants real gold next time. That's the level we're talking about. Kings arguing about the quality of gold statues. Empires rich enough to care about details like that. Keep moving. Mycenaeans and Greece, not unified. Bunch of kingdoms. Mycenaeans, Pios, thieves. Each one has a palace. Each palace has scribes who write in linear B. They track everything. How much grain in storage, how many sheep, how much bronze, who owes what to whom. The palaces control the economy. Craftsmen work for the palace. They make weapons and pottery and textiles. The palace redistributes goods. It's not exactly a market economy, more like a command economy, but it works. The population grows, the palaces get bigger, and the trade, that's what really matters. Ships cross the Mediterranean constantly. They carry copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, wine from Greece, olive oil from Crete, purple dye from Thai. One shipwreck tells the whole story found off the coast of Turkey. The Uluburan wreck. It sank around 1300 BC, about 80 years before the collapse. The cargo is incredible. 10 tons of copper, 1 ton of tin, enough to make 11 tons of bronze, glass ingots, ebony logs, ivory tusks, ostrich eggs, jewelry, weapons, pottery, from 7 different places. This was one ship, one voyage, and it was carrying the wealth of nations. The ship probably started in the eastern Mediterranean, maybe Thai or Sidon. It picked up cargo at different ports. Copper from Cyprus, tin from somewhere in the east. It was heading west, maybe to Greece, maybe to Italy. It never made it. Storm, pirates, rocks, something. The ship went down with everything. But here's what matters. This was normal. Ships like this cross the sea all the time. The trade network was vast, complex, reliable. Cities depended on it. You can't make bronze without copper and tin. You can't get both in the same place. Copper comes from Cyprus. Tin comes from Afghanistan or maybe Spain or Brita. You need both, which means you need trade. The palaces needed bronze for tools, for weapons, for prestige items. Bronze was the steel of the ancient world. You couldn't run an empire without it. So, the trade kept going. Ships sailing, merchants traveling, goods moving from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. And it wasn't just goods. Ideas moved too. Writing systems, artistic styles, religious concepts, technologies. The palace at Pios in Greece has fresco that look Egyptian. The Hittites adopted Mesopotamian uniform. Egyptian scarabs show up in Greece. Greek pottery shows up in Egypt. This was a connected world. Not globalized like today, but connected. The elites knew about each other. They competed, they copied, they traded. They married each other's daughters. The common people probably didn't think about it much. A farmer in Greece didn't care about the Hittite king, but he used bronze tools. He might have worn an amber bead from the Baltic. His wife might have used Egyptian coal for eye makeup. The system worked because it was stable. The same kingdoms had existed for centuries. Egypt had been around for 2,000 years, the Hittites for 500 years, Mycenaean Greece for 400 years. People expected it to continue. Why wouldn't it? Their grandparents had lived in this world, their great-grandparents. The palaces seemed permanent. The trade routes seemed secure. The kings seemed powerful. Nobody saw it coming. There were small signs. Maybe. Looking back, we can see things that might have been warnings, but people at the time probably didn't notice. Some letters mention grain shortages. The Hittite king writes to the king of Ugarit. He needs grain. Urgently, Uga sends ships full of grain to Hittusa. Other letters mention raiders, ships attacking coastal cities. The king of Elashia writes to the king of Ugarit. He warns about enemy ships, 7 of them. They've been raiding burning cities, but these seem like normal problems. Empires always need grain. Pirates always exist. Nothing to panic about. The palaces keep building. Mycenaeans expands its walls. The Hittites build new temples. Egypt fights wars in Syria and wins. Everything seems fine. Around 1200 BC, Ramses III defeats invaders. He calls them the Sea Peoples. He has the battle carved on temple walls. It looks like a great victory. Egypt stands strong. The pharaoh protects his people. But something is different. The inscriptions mention something strange. The invaders came with their families, their possessions. They weren't just raiders. They were refugees looking for new land. Why? Where did they come from? What were they running from? Nobody wrote it down. Or, if they did, those records didn't survive. Within a generation, everything falls apart. The Hittite Empire vanishes, not defeated in battle. Just gone. The capital abandoned. The archives stop. No more letters. No more treaties. Silence. Mycenaean Greece collapses. The palaces burn. Pios destroyed. Mycenae survives but shrinks. Tian abandoned. The Linear B tablets stop. Writing disappears. For 400 years, nobody in Greece knows how to write. Ugarit destroyed completely. The city burns so hot that mud bricks turn to slag. Nobody rebuilds. The site stays empty. 40 cities along the eastern Mediterranean coast gone. Some burned, some abandoned, some show signs of earthquake damage, but all of them are empty. The trade network breaks. Ships stop sailing. Or maybe there aren't enough ships. Or maybe the ports are destroyed. Either way, the copper from Cyprus stops reaching Greece. The tin from the east stops moving. Bronze producty on drops. Some places go back to using stone tools. Egypt survives barely. Ramesses III keeps the kingdom together, but Egypt never fully recovers. The empire shrinks, the wealth declines. Later, pharaohs are weaker. The new kingdom ends within a century. The world that existed in 1200 BC was gone by 1150 BC. 50 years, that's one lifetime, one generation. People who were children in 1200 BC were old in 1150 BC. They watched their world end. The palaces they grew up in were ruins. The trade they depended on was memory. The writing they learned was useless because nobody else could read anymore. What do you tell your children when that happens? How do you explain that everything you knew is over? That the world they'll inherit is smaller, poorer, darker than the one you were born into? The survivors adapted. They had to. They lived in villages instead of cities. They farmed. They raised animals. They told stories about the old days, about great kings and heroes and wars, stories that would eventually become the Iliad and the Odyssey. But the Bronze Age was over, the age of palaces and scribes and international trade. The age when kings called each other brother and argued about gold tates. That world believed it would last forever. It was wrong. We're all falling asleep to the same mysteries, just hours apart. Subscribe and tell me where you're from. Anyway, back to 1177 BC. The Golden Age didn't last. The palaces that seemed permanent weren't. The trade routes that seemed secure weren't. The kings who seemed powerful weren't. Something was coming. The first signs were already there. Small things easy to miss until they weren't small anymore. The cracks started small. Easy to miss if you weren't looking. Around 1250 BC, something changed in the weather. Not everywhere, not all at once, but the climate shifted. Drier, hotter in summer, less rain when crops needed it. In Syria, farmers noticed first. The harvest came up short. Not a disaster, just less grain than usual. They adjusted, planted different fields, hoped next year would be better. It wasn't. The drought lasted 3 years in some places, 5 in others. Rivers ran lower, wells dried up, pastures turned brown earlier each summer. People moved, not far, just to where water still flowed. A village here, a town there, small migrations, the kind that had happened before. But this time, everyone was moving at once. Think about what that means. Picture a trade route. Merchants travel from Egypt to the Hittite Empire. They stop at the same towns every trip, buy food, rest their donkeys, trade news. Now, those towns are empty. The food's more expensive. The merchants who used to meet them there are gone, moved north or south, or just disappeared. The network starts to fray. In 1225 BC, a Hittite king writes a letter. We have it. Baked clay preserved in ruins. He's writing to the king of Ugarit, a coastal city in what's now Syria. The letter is about grain. The Hittite king needs it desperately. His own harvest failed. His people are hungry. He's asking Ugarit to send ships loaded with grain, as much as they can spare. Ugarit writes back, they're sorry. They can't help. Their own grain stores are low. They're rationing what they have. This is new. These kingdoms had traded for centuries. They helped each other. That was the system. That was how it worked. Now the system was breaking. More letters survive from this period. More requests, more refusals. Kings begging for food, for copper, for wood, getting turned down, or getting less than they ask for. The tone changes too. Earlier letter. RS are polite, formal, full of diplomatic language about brotherhood and friendship. These later letters are blunt, worried, sometimes angry. One king complains that a shipment arrived half empty. Where's the rest? Did someone steal it? Is this an insult? Another king writes that he sent gold but received nothing in return. He wants an explanation now. The trust was cracking, and then the earthquake started. We know this from archaeology. Layers of destruction in multiple cities, all from the same period, all showing the same pattern. Walls collapsed, buildings pancaked, storage jars shattered. The destruction is sudden, total, and it matches what earthquakes do. Troy was hit. Level 7A shows massive earthquake damage around 1250 BC. The famous city from Homer's poems. The walls came down not from Greek warriors from the ground shaking. Mycenaeans shows damage too, and Tyans and Pios, all within a few decades of each other. The eastern Mediterranean sits on fault lines. Earthquakes happen, always have, but this period saw a cluster. Multiple major earthquakes in a short time. Cities rebuilt. They always did. But rebuilding takes resources, takes time, takes grain to feed the workers, takes copper for tools, takes wood for scaffolding. And all of those things were already running short. Here's what archaeologists found in Pios. The palace there kept detailed records. Clay tablets listing everything, how much grain in storage, how many sheep, how many bronze weapons, who owed what to whom. The final tablets show something strange. They're rushed, sloppy. The handwriting is bad. Mistakes everywhere, like someone was writing fast, under pressure. One tablet lists coastal watchers, men assigned to watch the sea, to warn if ships approach. Another tablet inventories bronze, every scrap, even bronze from religious offerings. They're melting it down, making weapons. The last tablet mentions women and children being sent inland, away from the coast to safety. And then the tablets stop. The palace burned. The tablets were baked hard in the fire. That's the only reason they survived. Nobody wrote anything after that. The scribes were gone or dead, or they fled and never came back. Chios was never rebuilt. The ruins sat empty. For 400 years, nobody lived there. This pattern repeats. Ugarit on the Syrian coast. Prosperous city, major port, beautiful palaces. The last level shows frantic preparation, weapons stockpiled, valuables buried, then destruction, fire, abandonment. Last king of Ugarit wrote a letter. It was found in the ruins. He's writing to the king of Cyprus, asking for help. Enemy ships have been sighted. His own army is gone, fighting somewhere else. His ships are gone too, scattered. He's defenseless. The city is exposed. The letter was never sent. It was still in the palace when the palace burned. What happened to the king? Nobody knows. His name disappears from history. The Hittite Empire shows the same pattern. Their capital Hata was enormous. Massive walls, grand temples, archives full of treaties and letters and laws. Around 1200 BC, they abandoned it, just walked away. The city wasn't destroyed by enemies. It was deliberately emptied. The government collapsed from within. The last Hittite texts mentioned food shortages, rebellions in the provinces, trouble on the borders, then silence. The empire that had lasted 450 years vanished in a generation. Egypt survived barely. Ramesses III fought off invasions, multiple invasions. He recorded them on top temple walls, images of battles, foreigners with strange weapons, ships with bird-headed prows, Mies of mixed peoples. He calls them the Sea Peoples. We still use that name, but it doesn't tell us much. Who were they? Where did they come from? The images show different groups, different clothes, different ships. Maybe they weren't one people. Maybe they were refugees, survivors from collapsed kingdoms, pirates, mercenaries, displaced farmers turned raiders. Egypt beat them back, but the cost was enormous. The treasury was drained. The army was exhausted. The trade network was gone. There was nobody left to trade with. After Isi, Egypt declined. Slowly, the empire shrank. The power faded. They survived, but they never recovered their golden age. Here's what's haunting about this period. The collapse happened fast, but the warning signs were there for decades. The drought, the failed harvests, the fraying trade networks, the desperate letters, the earthquakes, the stockpiling of weapons, the coastal watches. People saw it coming. They tried to prepare. They asked for help. They made plans. It didn't matter. The system was too fragile, too interconnected. When one part failed, everything failed. The Bronze Age world was like a rope made of many strands. Each strand was strong, but they were wound together, dependent on each other. Egypt needed copper from Cyprus. Cyprus needed grain from Egypt. The Hittites needed both. It needed everyone. When the rope started to fray, you couldn't just replace one strand. The whole thing unraveled. And once it started, nobody could stop it. The cracks became breaks. The breaks became collapse. The collapse became darkness. They came from the sea. At least that's what the Egyptian records say. The temple walls at Medinet Habu tell the story carved in stone. Ramesses III commissioned them around 1177 BC. The images show ships with bird-headed prows, warriors with horned helmets, chariots, oxmen pulling carts loaded with families, women and children mixed with fighters. The inscription calls them the foreign countries who conspired in their islands. They came by land and sea. They destroyed everything in their path. Hatti fell. So did Koda, Kamish, Azawa, Alashia, one after another. The names mean nothing now, but these were kingdoms, major powers. They had armies, fortified cities, trade networks. They weren't weak. They fell anyway. The Egyptian text describes the invasion. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once, the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. Read that again. No land could stand before their arms. These weren't raids. This was something bigger. A migration maybe, or multiple migrations happening at once. Groups of people moving together, bringing everything they owned, fighting anyone who got in the way. The images show details. The ships are different from Egyptian ships, higher prows, different rigging. The warriors carry round shields, long swords. Some wear kilts with tassels, others wear different clothes entirely. They're not uniform, not one people. The Egyptians list different groups. The Peliset, the Checker, the Shechesh, the Denyen, the Wesh. 5 main groups, maybe more. Each one distinct, each one dangerous. Who were they? That's the question that haunts this whole story. Some scholars think the Peliset became the Philistines, the ones from the Bible. They settled in Gaza after Egypt defeated them. The pottery found in Philistine sites matches pottery from the Aon, from Greece, from the Mycenaean world. Maybe they were refugees from the collapsed Mycenaean kingdoms, warriors without homes. Famine lies fleeing disaster. They needed somewhere to go, so they went south toward Egypt, toward the last functioning empire. The Shechesh might have been from Sicily. The name sounds similar, but that's speculation. We don't know. The Denyen might have been from the Greek city of Danos. Again, maybe. The evidence is thin. Here's what we do know. They arrived in waves, multiple attacks over several decades. The first wave hit around 1207 BC, during the reign of Ramesses II, III's predecessor. That attack was beaten back, but they returned stronger, more organized. The second wave came around 1177 BC. This time, they brought everything: families, livestock, carts full of possessions. This wasn't a raid. This was a migration. They moved down the coast, through what's now Turkey, through Syria, through Lebanon, destroying cities as they went. Uga fell to them, or fell during the chaos they caused. The city burned. The palace collapsed. Bodies were left in the streets. Nobody rebuilt it. The same pattern repeated down the coast, city after city. Some fought, some surrendered, some were just abandoned before the invaders arrived. By the time they reached Egypt, they'd carved a path of destruction, Euxin through the entire eastern Mediterranean. Ramesses III met them at the mouth of the Nile. The battle scenes carved at Medinet Habu show the fight. Egyptian archers on ships, arrows raining down, enemy ships capsizing, warriors drowning, bodies in the water. On land, Egyptian chariots charge, infantry with spears. The invaders fight back, but they're losing. The carvings show Egyptian victory. Prisoners being led away. Piles of severed hands. That's how Egyptians counted enemy dead, by cutting off their hands. Egypt won, but barely. The cost was enormous. The treasury was drained. The army was exhausted. Trade was gone. There was nobody left to trade with. The network had collapsed. And here's the thing that bothers me about this story. The Sea Peoples won almost everywhere else. They destroyed kingdoms, toppled empires, burned cities that had stood for centuries. But we don't know what happened to them after Egypt. Some settled in Canaan, the Philistines. We know about them. But the others, the Shecher, the Shechesh, the Denyen, the Wesh, they vanished from the record, just like the kingdoms they destroyed. Maybe they settled somewhere, blended in, lost their identity. Maybe they kept moving, scattered, died out. Or maybe they were never really one thing to begin with. Think about what a collapse looks like. Not from the perspective of kingdoms, from the perspective of normal people. Your city is starving. The harvest failed 3 years running. The king demands taxes anyway. He needs bronze for weapons, grain for soldiers. The enemy is coming. Or maybe there is no enemy. Maybe it's just chaos. You leave. What choice do you have? You take your family. Your neighbors come too. You join other refugees on the road. More people from other towns, other cities. You need food. You need safety. You find a village. They won't share. They don't have enough for themselves. You take what you need by force if necessary. Now you're raiders, not because you wanted to. Because you had to survive. You keep moving. Join other groups. Some are warriors, mercenaries who lost their employers. Some are farmers. Some are craftsmen. You're all mixed together now. Different languages, different clothes, different weapons, but you're moving in the same direction, towards somewhere that still has food, still has order, still has walls that might protect you. That's what the CPOP, they might have been. Not an army, not an invasion force, a mass movement of desperate people created by the collapse, making the collapse worse. The Egyptian texts call them invaders, enemies, foreigners, but maybe they were victims too. Refugees from the disaster that was swallowing the Bronze Age world. The evidence fits, the mixed equipment, the families traveling with warriors, the different groups working together, the desperation. They weren't trying to conquer Egypt, they were trying to survive. Egypt just happened to be in the way, and Egypt was the only kingdom strong enough to stop them. But stopping them didn't fix anything. The damage was done. The trade network was destroyed. The other kingdoms were gone. Egypt stood alone, isolated, surrounded by ruins. The Sea Peoples were the final blow. But they weren't the cause. The cause was deeper. The drought, the earthquakes, the failing harvests, the breaking trade routes, the accumulating stress on a system that couldn't bend. The Sea Peoples were the symptom, the visible part of a collapse that had already started. Here's what haunts me. We name them, we study them, we carve them into our theories about what happened, but we don't really know who they were. The Egyptians didn't know either. They just knew people were coming. Dangerous people, desperate people, people who had nothing left to lose. The images at Medinet Haru show them clearly. You can see their faces, their clothes, their weapons, their ships. They're right there, preserved in stone. But we still can't tell you where they came from, where they went, what they called themselves, what stories they told about why they were moving, what they'd lost, what they hoped to find. They're ghosts, visible but unknowable, the face of catastrophe, the human cost of collapse. And maybe that's fitting because the Bronze Age collapse wasn't really about kingdoms and empires and trade networks, not at the human level. It was about millions of people whose lives were destroyed, who lost everything, who wandered, who fought, who died, who survived and tried to rebuild in the ruins. The Sea Peoples were some of those people. The ones who made it into Egyptian records, the ones who got carved into stone. The ones we remember, but they were just a fraction. Most of the displaced, most of the refugees, most of the victims, they left no trace, no records, no carvings, no names. They just disappeared into the darkness that followed, into the 400 years when writing stopped, when cities emptied, when the population crashed, when the survivors forgot most of what their grandparents knew. The Sea Peoples attacked Egypt in 1177 BC. Egypt survived barely. But the world they'd known, the Bronze Age world, the interconnected network of kingdoms and trade and culture, that world was already gone. The Sea Peoples were just the last ones to realize it, the last ones still moving through the ruins, looking for something that didn't exist anymore. A world that worked, a world that made sense. A world where you could plan for tomorrow. That world had ended, and nobody was coming to rebuild it. The fall happened fast, faster than anyone expected, faster than made sense. Start with Mycenae, the great fortress city in Greece. Massive walls, stone blocks so big that later Greeks thought giants must have built them. The palace sits on top of a hill. You can see for miles in every direction. Perfect defensive position. Around 1190 BC, it burns. Not from accident, not from lightning, from attack. The destruction layer shows it clearly. Ash, collapsed walls, ashed pottery, bodies left where they fell. But here's the strange part. The city had warning. They knew something was coming. The archaeological evidence shows frantic preparation in the years before the fire. They built new fortifications, strengthened the walls, dug a secret passage to a water source outside the city in case of siege. They saw it coming. They prepared. It didn't matter. Mycenae fell anyway, and it wasn't rebuilt. Not properly. Some people came back, lived in the ruins for a while, but the palace stayed empty. The great hall stayed silent. The throne room stayed cold. The same pattern repeats across Greece. Tian burns around the same time. Pios burns earlier, maybe 1180 BC. Thebes survives longer, but shrinks. The population drops by 75% or more in some regions. These weren't weak cities. They had armies, professional soldiers, bronze weapons, chariots, stone walls 20 feet thick. They'd defended themselves before against raiders, against rivals, against threats. They understood this was different. This was overwhelming. Or maybe it wasn't even an attack. Maybe people just left, move east. The Hittite Empire controlled most of what's now Turkey. Their capital, Hattusa, was one of the great cities of the age. We talked about it earlier. The temples, the palaces, the massive walls. Around 1180 BC, the city empties. Not burns, empties. The archaeological records show something weird. The city wasn't sacked. There's no destruction layer, no bodies, no signs of battle. People just stopped living there. They took what they could carry, left everything else, and walked away. The great temple stood empty. The palaces echoed. The archives full of clay tablets sat undisturbed for a while. Then squatters moved in. People who didn't know what the buildings were, for didn't know how to read the tablets. They lived in the ruins for a generation or two, built crude shelters against the old walls. Eventually, they left too. By 1150 BC, Hattusa was abandoned completely. The Hittite Empire, which had rivaled Egypt for power, just ceased to exist. No successor state, no remnant kingdom, nothing. The king disappeared. The army vanished. The bureaucracy dissolved. Centuries of records and treaties and royal correspondence became meaningless scratches on clay. Down the coast, city after city follows the same pattern. Ugarit burns completely. We mentioned that before, but the details matter. The destruction was total. Every major building collapsed. The palace, the temples, the houses of the rich merchants. Even the city walls fell. Excavations found bodies in the streets. Skeletons still wearing jewelry, gold earrings, silver bracelets. Nobody looted them. Nobody came back to bury the dead properly. The city just died and stayed dead. Alalak, another major city in Syria, burns around the same time. So does Hamath and Katna and Hazor. The list goes on. 40 cities destroyed in 50 years, maybe more. Those are just the ones archaeologists have excavated. Think about what that means. These cities were spread across hundreds of miles. Different kingdoms, different rulers, different armies, but they all fell within a few decades of each other. All around 1200 BC, all in the same way. Fire, destruction, abandonment. Something was moving through the region, destroying everything in its path. Or maybe not something. Maybe the destruction was coming from inside, cities tearing themselves apart, populations fleeing, governments collapsing under their own weight. We don't know. The cities can't tell us, they just show the results. Ash layers, collapsed walls, etc. Tie streets. Egypt survived barely. But even Egypt felt the pressure. Ramesses III fought off the Sea Peoples. We covered that. But the cost was enormous. The military campaigns drained the treasury. The loss of trade partners crippled the economy. The empire shrank, pulled back, focused on defending what it had left. After Aseis III died around 1155 BC, Egypt entered a long decline. The new kingdom limped on for another century, but it was never the same. The Golden Age was over. The pharaohs who came after were weaker, poorer, less able to project power beyond Egypt's borders. By 1070 BC, even Egypt fractured. The country split into rival kingdoms, north and south. The unified empire that had lasted for centuries broke apart. Look at what disappeared. The palace economies collapsed first. These were centralized systems. The king owned everything, controlled everything, distributed everything. Scribes kept detailed records. How much grain in storage, how much bronze in the workshops, how many workers assigned to each task. When the palaces burned, those systems died. Nobody knew what was where. Nobody could organize production. Nobody could collect taxes or distribute rations. The whole structure fell apart. Writing disappeared in most places, not everywhere. Egypt kept writing. So did Mesopotamia. But in Greece, writing vanished completely. The linear B-crypt used for palace records was forgotten. For 400 years, nobody in Greece could read or write. That's not just losing a technology. That's losing the ability to keep records, to send messages, to preserve knowledge. Everything had to be remembered, passed down orally. And oral traditions lose details. They change. They simplify. The population crashed. Settlements that once housed thousands shrank to villages of hundreds or less. The countryside emptied. People clustered in defensible positions. Hilltops, islands, places where small groups could protect themselves. Trade stopped. The networks that connected Egypt to Greece, to Anizlia, to the Levant, just ceased functioning. Ships stopped sailing. Merchants stopped traveling. The flow of tin and copper that made bronze stopped moving. Without bronze, you can't make tools, can't make weapons, can't make the things that made Bronze Age civilization possible. Some places started using iron instead, but iron technology was new, primitive. The quality was terrible, like at first. The few objects that survive from the Dark Age that followed are crude, simple, nothing like the sophisticated craftsmanship of the Bronze Age. The skills were lost. The master craftsmen died or fled. Their apprentices never learned properly. Art declined. The beautiful fresco of Mycenaean palaces disappeared. The intricate jewelry, the carved ivory, the painted pottery, all gone, replaced by simple geometric patterns, basic shapes, the kind of decoration anyone could do without training. Here's what gets me: the speed. Bronze Age civilization took 2,000 years to build. From the first cities around 3,300 BC to the height of the late Bronze Age, around 1300 BC. 2,000 years of slow accumulation, knowledge building on knowledge, skills passed from master to apprentice, trade networks expanding, cities growing, empires rising. All of it collapsed in maybe 2 generations, 50 years, maybe less. A person born in 1200 BC would have grown up in a world of palaces and trade and writing and art. By the time they were old, all of that was gone. Ruins, memories, stories about how things used to be. Their grandchildren would grow up in villages, never see in a palace, never learning T, O red, never traveling beyond a day's walk from home. The world had shrunk, contracted, simplified, and nobody wrote down what it felt like. No chronicles of the collapse, no histories explaining what happened. The people who could write were dead or scattered. The palaces where they worked were ashes, were left with archaeology, layers of destruction, abandoned cities, broken pottery, the silent evidence of catastrophe. The dominoes fell in sequence, but also all at once. Each collapse made the next one more likely. Each broken trade route made the network weaker. Each abandoned city meant fewer places to flee to. Each destroyed harvest meant more refugees, more pressure, more desperation. The system couldn't absorb the shocks. It was too interconnected, too specialized, too dependent on everything working smoothly. When one part failed, the stress spread like cracks in glass. One break leads to another, then another. Then the whole thing shatters. By 1150 BC, the Bronze Age world was gone, replaced by something smaller, simpler, poorer. The Dark Age had begun, and it would last 400 years before civilization started to rebuild. 4 centuries of darkness, of forgetting, of survival. The descendants of Bronze Age kings lived in villages, told stories about the great palaces their ancestors built, but they couldn't read the tablets, couldn't understand the technology, couldn't recreate what was lost. The world had to start over almost from scratch, building new kingdoms, new trade routes, new forms of writing, new ways of organizing society. But that came later, much later. First came the darkness, the silence, the ruins. The dominoes had fallen, and nobody could stand them back up. So who destroyed the cities? The obvious answer is the sea peoples, the raiders from the Egyptian records, the warriors with horned helmets who came by ship and chariot. But here's the problem with that theory. It's too simple, too neat, and the evidence doesn't quite fit. Start with the most basic question. Who were they? The Egyptian texts give names. The Pelisit, the Checker, the Shechish. But names don't tell us much. Where did they come from? Why did they move? What made them so dangerous? Some scholars say they came from the Aeon, from Greece or the islands around it. The pottery evidence supports this. Sites where the Peliset settled show Greek-style pottery, the kind made in Mycenae and other Greek cities. But wait, Mycenae was collapsing at the same time. The palaces there were burning too, so were the sea people's refugees from Greece, people fleeing their own collapsing civilization. That would explain why families came with them. Women, children, oxen carts loaded with belongings. You don't bring your family on a raid. You bring them when you're looking for a new home. Other scholars point to Anatolia, the western coast of what's now Turkey. There were kingdoms there, small ones. They show up in Hittite records. Azawa, Luka. The Hittites fought them sometimes, made treaties with them other times. When the Hittite Empire collapsed, those kingdoms would have been freed. No more tribute to pay. No more Hittite armies to fear. Maybe they saw an opportunity, moved south, attacked the wealthy coastal cities. But that doesn't explain the scale. These weren't just border raids. 40 cities fell. Kingdoms disappeared. That takes more than a few freed vassals looking for plunder. Here's another theory. Climate refugees. We know the drought was bad. We know it lasted years, maybe decades in some places. People had to move, had to find water, find food, find land that still produced crops. When you're desperate, you fight. You take what you need. If that means attacking a city, you attack. If that means destroying what you can't carry, you destroy it. The problem is coordination. How did all these different groups move together? The Egyptian records show multiple peoples, different names, different origins probably, But they attacked at the same time, moved in the same direction, destroyed the same targets. That suggests organization, leadership, some kind of alliance or confederation. But we have no evidence for that. No records of Sea Peoples' kingdoms, no treaties, no diplomatic correspondence. They appear in Egyptian records as invaders. Then they disappear. Some settled in Gaza, became the Philistines, but most just vanish from history. Where did they go? Did they scatter, die, assimilate into other populations? We don't know. And here's what really troubles the raider theory. The timeline doesn't work, not completely. Ugarit burned around 1190 BC. The texts from the city show panic in the final years, letters begging for help, warnings about ships approaching, then destruction, total complete. But other cities fell earlier or later. The destruction wasn't simultaneous. It spread over 50 years, maybe 70. That's a long time for a single invasion force to stay active. A long time for raiders to keep moving, keep attacking, keep winning. Raiders want loot. They hit a city, take what they can carry, move on. They don't usually burn everything. Don't destroy what could be useful. Don't kill everyone when slaves are valuable. The Bronze Age collapse shows different patterns. Some cities burned, others were abandoned without signs of violence. Others show evidence of internal collapse, civil war maybe, or revolution. The palace class overthrown, the records destroyed deliberately. That suggests the Sea Peoples weren't the only problem. Maybe not even the main problem. Look at the Hittite capital. Hattusa didn't burn, it emptied. People left, took what they could, walked away. No battle, no siege, no invaders forcing them out. Why would they leave? Maybe the government collapsed. Maybe the king died without an heir. Maybe the bureaucracy fell apart. The palace economy stopped functioning. Without central organization, the city couldn't feed itself, couldn't distribute resources. People had to leave, find somewhere else to survive. The Sea Peoples might have attacked some cities, probably did. The Egyptian evidence is clear about that. But they didn't destroy the whole system. They couldn't have. The system was already failing. Think about it differently. Imagine modern supply chains. Everything connected. Food from one region, fuel from another, electronics from a third. Now, imagine one major disruption. A war, a pandemic, a financial crash. The system adapts usually. But if disruptions keep coming, if they hit multiple points at once, the whole network can collapse. Not because any single disruption was fatal, because the cumulative stress was too much. That might be what happened in 1177 BC. The drought stressed the agricultural base, trade routes broke down, refugees moved, government struggled, raiders saw weakness and attacked. Each problem made the others worse. The Sea Peoples were part of it, but only part. They were a symptom as much as a cause. Some scholars go further. They say the Sea Peoples were invented, not literally, but exaggerated. Ramses III needed a victory, needed to show Egypt was strong, unconquerable. So he took credit for defeating a massive invasion. The reliefs at Medine, at Heru show him winning, crushing the foreign hordes, saving Egypt. But maybe the actual battles were smaller. Maybe the conspiracy in their islands was just normal raiding amplified in royal propaganda. That feels too cynical to me. The destruction was real. The cities really burned. The kingdoms really fell. Something happened. Something big. But the raider theory has holes, big ones. It explains some of the evidence, not all of it. Not the abandoned cities, not the long timeline, not the economic collapse that preceded the attacks. We want a simple answer. A clear villain. The Sea Peoples fit that role. Mysterious invaders from across the sea. Destroying civilization. It's dramatic. It's compelling. It's probably wrong, or at least incomplete. The truth seems messier. Multiple causes, different problems in different places. Some cities fell to raiders, others to drought, others to internal collapse, others to some combination we can't untangle anymore. The sea peoples were real. They attacked. They destroyed. But they didn't cause the collapse alone. They couldn't have. They were the final push, the last straw, the thing that broke a system already cracking under too much pressure. Regarding. And maybe that's scarier than simple invasion. It means there was no single enemy, no clear threat to fight, just a cascade of failures, each one making the next more likely until everything fell apart. The dominoes were already wobbling. The sea peoples just knocked over the first one. Now, let's talk about something a lot of people miss when they think about why everything collapsed. The climate. Not just a single bad year or one failed harvest, but a stretch of years where the weather changed in ways that nobody saw coming. This is where things get interesting, because unlike a simple invasion or a single earthquake, climate is everywhere. It touches every kingdom, every farm, every person. It's slow at first, almost invisible, but over time, it can break even the stronger societies. Picture a farmer in a small village. For generations, his family has grown barley and wheat. The seasons have a rhythm. Plant in the fall, pray for rain, harvest in the spring. One year the rains come late, the crops are thin, people grumble, but they manage. The next year, it's even drier. Wells are lower than anyone remembers. The river, near the field, shrinks. The yield drops again. Now people are, I was worried. They plant extra, hoping for a better year. But the third year is the worst yet. The ground is cracked. The grain heads are empty. Animals grow thin, struggling to find grass. This isn't just a story. Scientists have found evidence in ancient pollen samples in lake beds and caves. In some places, the trees that grew there for centuries suddenly vanish from the record. The plants that replace them are tough, scrubby, built for dry weather. In mud from dried-up lakes, you see layers that show a sharp drop in rainfall around 1200 BC, not just for a season. This was a drought that lasted many years. Letters from the time mention hunger and requests for food. Kings write to each other, asking for help. Send grain. One message pleads, "My people are starving." Another letter says, "I have no seed corn left. My land cannot feed my city." These are not just local problems. The same struggle shows up from Greece to Egypt. Now, think about what happens when you depend on other places for food. Trade was the lifeline of these kingdoms. Egypt might send grain north, or a city by the sea might ship wine and olive oil inland. But if everyone is struggling, nobody has extra. The ships stow. Coming. The markets go quiet. People start moving, searching for better land or just something to eat. Archaeologists even found abandoned fields where irrigation channels were left unfinished, like the workers just walked away. In the ruins of towns, storage jars stand empty. No grain, no olives, nothing. Some buildings were never rebuilt. Others show signs that people tried to hang on, patching walls, digging new wells, but it wasn't enough. Over time, whole regions just fade from the map. What's fascinating is that climate doesn't destroy a city directly. There's no fire, no army at the gates. Instead, it slowly eats away at the things that keep life going. Food, water, order. As crops fail, people grow desperate. Some leave, some fight over the scraps. Civil wars and uprisings become more common. Governments that once seemed unshakable start to break down. And here's the thing, the rich and powerful feel it too. The palaces had stores of food, but even those run out if the drought keeps going. Officials argue over who gets what. Soldiers demand pay. If the king can't feed his army, loyalty disappears. The chain of command weakens. The whole system starts to wobble. Now, imagine. Neither this isn't just happening in one city. It's a wave rolling across the land. One kingdom after another facing the same crisis. Some try to ride it out by tightening control, demanding more from their people. Others try to trade for what they need. But soon, no one has anything to spare. The web of connections that held the world together starts to snap. You see this in the records left behind. A king in Ugarit writes a desperate note to a neighboring city begging for grain. He gets an answer. Sorry, we can't help. We're starving too. In Egypt, officials record shipments of food sent up the Nile, but the amounts get smaller each year. There are hints in the art, scenes of thin cattle, of people hunting for wild plants, of shrines to the gods, asking for rain. Meanwhile, as people grow hungry and scared, they start to move. Families pack up what they can carry and walk to the next valley or the next city, hoping for better luck. Some end up on the coast, where fishing is still possible. Others head for riverbanks or places where springs haven't dried up. But the crowds keep growing, and nobody has enough. This is where violence starts to creep in. When resources run low, people fight. Gats over what's left. Old rivalries flare up. Small disputes turn deadly. In some places, the local leaders lose control. Law and order break down. Bands of hungry people become raiders themselves, attacking farms or caravans just to survive. But it's not just about food. When the climate shifts, it changes everything. Farmers can't rely on the old planting times. Shepherds can't find grass for their flocks. Craftsmen can't sell their goods because nobody has money to spend. Priests lose their authority when prayers for rain go unanswered. The old ways stop working. You can see it in the way cities shrink. The rich neighborhoods are abandoned first. People with enough money or power leave early. The poor stay behind hoping things will turn around. Sometimes they do for a year or two. Then another dry season hits and more people disappear. In some places, people built new walls trying to protect what was left. In others, they tore down the old temples for building stones. You find signs that people were eating whatever they could find, wild plants, even the bones of animals that died from hunger. Now, let's talk about how this connects to the bigger picture. When you look at all the evidence, the pollen, the letters, the abandoned villages, it lines up with other changes. The trading ships stop coming. The big markets go quiet. Fewer luxury goods move around. The old alliances between kings fall apart. Everyone is looking out for themselves. And this is where the dominoes start falling faster. When one kingdom falls, it puts pressure on the ones nearby. Refugees show up at the city gates asking for help. Sometimes they're let in. Sometimes they're turned away. When enough desperate people gather, they might try to take the city by force. The climate theory helps explain why everything unraveled so quickly. Not because one bad harvest is enough to topple a kingdom, but because a string of bad years wears down everyone. It wears down the leaders, the farmers, the trade, 99s. Hope fades, and with it, the energy to keep rebuilding. The world that once seemed stable starts to feel fragile. Some scientists think the droughts were caused by changes in the weather system over the Mediterranean. Maybe cooler temperatures in the Atlantic meant fewer storms reached the land, or maybe volcanic eruptions somewhere else in the world changed the climate for years. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Less rain, less food, more fear. And here's what fascinates me. People tried everything they could think of. They built new wells, dug deeper for water, switched crops, even moved entire towns. But sometimes all the effort in the world can't turn the weather back. Sometimes it just keeps getting worse. There are signs of prayers and sacrifices, temples with offerings left behind, sometimes in a hurry, carvings that show people asking the gods for help. But the rain didn't come. The rivers kept shrinking. As the climate crisis dragged on, it created cracks in everything. The palaces lost their grip. The old families who'd ruled for generations disappeared. Records stopped being kept. Writing faded away in South places as fewer people could afford to learn or teach it. Art turned simpler, rougher, almost childlike. People focused on survival, not beauty. What's left in the dirt tells the story. In one town, you find layers of ash from a fire, but no sign of battle. The place just burned and was never rebuilt. In another, the houses get smaller each year until they're little more than huts. Sometimes you find graves with no markers, hastily dug, with few goods inside. And it's not just one culture or one language. The same pattern appears from Greece to Canaan to the Nile. Cities shrink, rural areas empty out, and the population drops. Some people survive by joining new groups, blending in or moving far away. Others vanish from the record. The climate didn't care about borders or kings. It hit everyone. That's what makes it so powerful and so hard to fight. You can't bribe a drought. You can't build a wall against less rain. You can only hold on as long as you can and hope for better years ahead. Some places did recover, but it took a long time. Generations passed before new kingdoms rose. By then, the old world was gone. The records, the languages, the stories, many were lost forever. People remembered only pieces, handed down in legends and myths. Here's something to think about. When we look back, it's easy to see the collapse is sudden. But for the people living through it, it was probably a slow grind. Every year, a little worse. Every spring, less hope. The world changing bit by bit until one day it was unrecognizable. And maybe that's why climate is such a scary cause. It's not dramatic, not flashy, no single villain to blame, just a slow, relentless pressure that wears down even the strongest. But climate isn't fate. People made choices. Some adapted, some moved, some fought. The story of this collapse is also a story of survival, of people figuring out new ways to live, even as everything they knew slipped away. If you stand on the ruins today, you can almost feel it, the silence, the emptiness, the sense of lives interrupted. It wasn't just the buildings that fell. It was a way of life, a sense of order, a belief that the world made sense. And yet, out of that darkness, something new eventually grew. The survivors built new cities, new cultures appeared, using what little they remembered. The world didn't end, it changed. So, when you hear about ancient rorts and failed harvests, remember those numbers, those layers as mud, those empty jars. They're the traces of real people. People who hoped for rain, planted seeds, and watched the sky just like we do now. And, as the climate theory shows, sometimes it's not the big disasters that break a world. Sometimes it's the quiet ones, the missing rain, the empty fields, the river that never comes back. And that brings us to another piece of the puzzle. The land itself wasn't just drying out, it was shaking. What about earthquakes? Let's look at that next. Let's get into the earthquake theory. It sounds dramatic, right? The land shaking, walls falling, people running in the night, and it really happened. This isn't just a story told by old poets. There's real evidence in the ground. Cracked foundations, toppled stones, cities that ended not in fire, but in rubble. So why do earthquakes matter here? Well, this part of the world is famous for them. Greece, Turkey, and the lands around them sit on a jigsaw puzzle of moving plates. Even today, The region shakes every few years. Back then, the cities were built on stone with heavy walls and columns. Great for keeping out enemies. Not so great when the ground starts moving. Let's picture a city. Maybe you Garrett, maybe my place, whose name is lost. It's a normal day. People working, trading, praying in the temple. Suddenly, the ground lurches. Not a gentle shake, a hard, rolling motion. Pots smash, walls tremble, roofs crack. People run outside shouting for family. Some buildings collapse completely. Others are left standing but with deep cracks running through them. When the dust settles, the city is in shock. Some people are dead, trapped under stones. Others are hurt. The streets are full of rubble. The temple has lost half its roof. The palace gate leans at a strange angle. There's no fire, no enemy at the gate. Just the silent, heavy damage left by nature. Now, you might ask, how do we know this really happened? Archaeologists have found layers in the dirt where buildings collapsed but didn't burn. The stones are broken, not scorched. The pattern matches known earthquake sites in other parts of the world. In some places, you see entire rows of houses knocked sideways. In others, huge stone blocks from city walls lie tumbled in neat lines like a child's building blocks after a rough shake. Let's talk about timing. Some of the cities that fell during those years show signs of earthquake damage right around the same time as the big collapse. For example, at Tiran in Greece, the lower walls and floors cracked in a way that matches earthquake destruction. At Mycenaeans, pieces of the palace fell in not from fire or attack, but from the earth moving beneath them. Then there's Ugarit up on the coast. The city was destroyed quickly. And while there's evidence of fire there, some of the buildings fell in a way that looks like the ground moved first. Some scientists believe an earthquake hit, knocking down walls, and then raiders or lutters came in afterward and set fires in the ruins. So, the disaster stacked on each other. Earthquake, then invasion or earthquake, then panic, then everything falls apart. You might wonder if one earthquake could destroy a city or if it would take more. Here's the truth: sometimes one big quake is enough, especially when buildings are made of stone and mud brick. But often, it's not just one. In a bad year, you might get a strong quake, then aftershocks for weeks or even months. Each one shakes already damaged walls. Even small tremors can bring down buildings that are cracked and weakened. And what about tsunamis? That's another part of the earthquake story. If a big quake happens under the sea, it can send a massive wall of water toward the coast. There's evidence that one of these hit the coast of the eastern Mediterranean during this period. In places like Mytos and the coast near Cyprus, muddy layers mixed with seashells show up in the ruins around 1200 BC. These aren't natural floods. They look more like a sudden, violent rush of water. Exactly what you'd expect from a tsunami. Now, imagine living through this. You survived the quake, but your house is gone. The granary is buried. The temple is cracked, maybe even collapsed. The well might be filled with debris. Roads are blocked. Some people leave at once looking for safer ground. Others stay, trying to dig out food and belongings. But then, a few days later, the aftershocks start. More walls fall. People lose hope. It's not just the physical damage. Quakes break the structure of daily life. The city government might fall apart. Priests are busy dealing with the dead or injured. Markets close. People stop working and start worrying. Fear spreads. Who will rebuild? Who will lead? In some places, no one does. The city just slowly empties out. And here's another detail. Some cities that fell during this time show signs of being rebuilt, but only in a rough, simple way. The grand palaces are left in ruins. New houses are small, made from whatever stones left. Sometimes whole neighborhoods are abandoned, and people cluster in just a few streets, using the old walls for shelter. It looks like people tried to hold on but didn't have the resources or the will to restore things to how they were. Now, why would earthquakes happen more during this period? Some scientists think there may have been a cluster of big quakes, almost a chain reaction along the fault lines that run through the region. If one fault slips, it can put pressure on another, causing more shaking a few years later. And when you combine this with drought, hunger, and the fear of attack, it's a recipe for disaster. People are already on edge. One quake can tip a stressed city into chaos. Let's look at the numbers. Today, strong earthquakes hit the region every few decades. Some are big enough to destroy whole towns. In the ancient world, without modern building codes, the same size quake would be much deadlier. Imagi, near a city with walls 20 feet high, but no steel or concrete, just mud, brick, and stone stacked by hand. When the ground shakes, those walls can turn to rubble in seconds. There's also evidence that the frequency of earthquakes might have gone up for a few centuries. Some scientists looked at ancient records and found a cluster of big quakes between 1300 and 1000 BC. That lines up with the timeline of the collapse. Not proof, but a strong clue. But let's not get carried away. Earthquakes alone can't explain the whole collapse. Some cities show fire and battle, not just shaking. Others have signs of slow decline with empty houses and unfinished repairs. And not every city that vanished sits on a known fault line. Some were far from the most dangerous areas. So, earthquakes are a piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture. What makes earthquakes so powerful as a theory, though, is how sudden they are. You can prepare for drought or defend against an enemy, but you can't see a quake coming, no warning, no time to run. 1 minute the world is normal, the next it's broken. That shock, both physical and emotional, can break a city's spirit almost overnight. Let's pause for a second and think about what that means. Imagine being a leader. You're trying to keep your people safe through years of bad harvests. You're worried about raiders, about trade drying up. Then, out of nowhere, the ground shakes and half your city falls down. Now you have to find food, shelter, and rebuild, all while people are scared and angry. It's too much for many leaders. Some just gave up. Some died in the chaos. Sometimes the survivors would move away. Maybe they found a safer spot or joined another group. Other times they tried to rebuild, but it never really worked. The city shrank. The palaces and temples stayed empty. The memory of the quake lived on. Maybe in stories, maybe as a warning scratched onto a wall. And here's something that fascinates me. When you look at the ruins today, you can sometimes see the moment everything changed. In one layer, the stones are neat. The rooms are tidy. Then, in the next, they're jumbled, broken, with no sign of fire or battle. Just collapse. It's like history stopped in a single moment. A normal day cut short by a force nobody could control. There's another piece to this. In some places, people seem to have blamed the gods. After a quake, they left offerings at ruined temples, sometimes valuables, sometimes food. Maybe they hoped a gift would stop the shaking. Or maybe they just needed to do something, anything, to feel like they had a little control. What does all this mean for the bigger story? Earthquakes didn't just smash buildings. They broke trust. Trust in leaders. Trust in the land itself. If the earth can't be counted on, what can? Add this to years of hunger, to fear of outsiders, to lost trade, and you get a world that feels dangerous on every side. And here's where the theories start to overlap. What if a city is hit by a quake during a bad drought? Food is already scarce now. The storage jars are broken. The wells are blocked. People can't count on help from neighbors because everyone is struggling. The shock of the quake might be the final straw. The thing that pushes families to leave or leaders to lose control. Some scholars think earthquakes also made it easier for invaders. Picture a city with damaged walls, open gates, and leaders distracted by disaster. Raiders don't need to fight as hard. They just walk in and take what they want. Or maybe the survivors leave the city open, hoping someone will help them rebuild. Instead, they get conquered. It's important to say, too, that some cities recovered. There are places where people rebuilt, where life went on, but the new cities were smaller, poorer, less grand. The memory of the shaking stuck around. Some cultures even built new temples on top of the ruins, maybe to show they could start again. So, what can we learn from all this? Earthquakes are a classic example of how nature can change history in an instant. You can prepare all you want, build the strongest walls, and still lose everything in a heartbeat. That's scary to think about, but it's also a reminder of how people keep going. Even after disaster, some try to rebuild, to start over, to hope again. Looking at the ruins, it's easy to feel far away from these people. But they dealt with the same fears and hopes we have now. They trusted the ground beneath their feet until it betrayed them. They tried to pick up the pieces to keep families together to survive. So, was it earthquakes alone that ended the old world? Almost certainly not. But they played a part. They made bad situations worse. They added chaos to a world already under pressure. And in some places, maybe they were the last blow. A force nobody could see coming, but one that changed everything in a single unforgettable moment. And that brings us to an even bigger question. Maybe it wasn't just earthquakes. Maybe it wasn't just drought. Maybe it wasn't any single cause at all. Maybe it was everything all at once, piling up until the world cracked under the weight. Let's talk about how all these pieces might fit together. Let's step back for a minute and look at this whole disaster with fresh eyes. We've talked about earthquakes, droughts, invasions, and sudden change. But when you add it all up, something still feels off. None of those things on their own can explain why things fell apart so completely in so many places, almost at the same time. So what if we're looking at this the wrong way? What if the real reason everything collapsed is because the whole system, the way the world worked, just stopped working? This idea is called systems collapse. It's a simple theory, but it changes how you see the past. You probably know the feeling in your own life. One thing goes wrong, you handle it. Two things go wrong, still okay. Three, maybe four things, and suddenly everything you built starts to wobble. Now, imagine that, but with entire kingdoms. Here's how it goes. These ancient societies were more connected than you'd think. They traded with each other, relied on each other for food, metal, and even ideas. Egypt sent gold north, Cyprus sent copper south, Greece shipped olive oil and wine east. In return, they got grain, timber, and even new styles of pottery. Worked when things were stable. The system made every kingdom richer, but it also made them dependent. If one part failed, it could set off a domino effect. Picture a row of dominoes on a table. Knock over the first one and the rest start to fall. That's what happened in the ancient world. A drought in one place meant less grain for everyone. A city destroyed by an earthquake meant one less trading partner. When invaders hit the coast, they cut off shipping lanes. Each problem made the others worse. The system wasn't built to handle so many shocks at once. Let's make it even simpler. Imagine you live in one of these cities. You're a potter, or a farmer, or maybe a merchant. You rely on copper from Cyprus to make bronze. You need grain from the north if your own fields fail. Your family wears linen from Egypt, uses oil pressed in Greece, and eats bread made from wheat brought in by ship. Your world isn't just your city. It's the whole network. Now, 1 year, 1 copper doesn't arrive. Raiders attack the mines, or maybe the ship never made it. You can't make bronze tools or weapons. Repairs stop. Soldiers can't get new swords. Farmers can't get new plows. At the same time, the weather shifts. Your own harvest is small. You need to buy grain, but the price has doubled. The traders are nervous. They don't want to risk their ships on a dangerous journey. Suddenly, even simple things become hard. That's the heart of systems collapse. It's not just one disaster. It's the way all the problems pile up until nobody can manage them anymore. Leaders who could handle one crisis at a time get overwhelmed when everything hits at once. Governments break down. Trade stops. People lose faith in their rulers. Some move away, others fight for what's left. And here's what makes it so tricky. When you look at the ruins today, you see burned buildings, fallen walls, and abandoned temples. But you can't see the invisible threads that held everything together. The trade deals, the alliances, the promises written on clay tablets or carved in stone. When those threads snapped, the whole world unraveled. Let's go deeper with a real example. Take Cyprus. Back then, Cyprus was the main source of copper in the area. No copper, no bronze, no new weapons or tools. When trouble hit Cyprus, raids, drought, or problems with mining, the supply of copper dried up. Suddenly, kingdoms that depended on bronze for their armies were in trouble. Blacksmiths couldn't make swords. Farmers couldn't fix their plows. Soldiers went into battle with old, dull weapons. Now, at the same time, the traders who used to carry copper by ship faced other problems. Maybe pirates attacked the coast. Maybe storms got worse and ships sank more often. Maybe the cost of hiring guards for each trip rose so high that merchants gave up. Each time a shipment failed, every city that depended on these goods felt the shock. It wasn't just about metal, it was about trust. Could you count on your neighbors to send help or grain or soldiers if you needed them? When the answer turned to no, the system started to fall apart. There's another piece to this puzzle. Writing. We think of writing as something for recording laws and stories, but in those days, it was also how kings made deals, set taxes, sent warnings, and planned wars. In the years before everything collapsed, you see fewer and fewer records, fewer letters between kings, fewer lists of shipments. It's like the world went quiet. Maybe the scribes left. Maybe the king stopped caring. Maybe there was nothing left to record. Some experts call this a loss of complexity. It's a fancy way of saying things became simpler, but not in a good way. The big cities emptied out, the palaces burned or crumbled. The people who stayed behind built smaller houses, used whatever old stones they could find, and grew just enough food to get by. They stopped making the fancy painted pottery. They stopped carving huge statues. It's not that they forgot how. They just didn't have the time or the resources anymore. Life shrank down to the basics: food, shelter, safety. Think about what this means for the people living through it. Imagine a child growing up in a city filled with tall walls and grand halls. By the time they're an adult, those walls are broken, the palaces are empty, and the city is half deserted. The stories their grandparents told don't match the world they see. The old ways don't work anymore. Maybe they leave looking for somewhere new to live. Maybe they stay, hoping things will turn around. Either way, the world they knew is gone. It's easy to imagine that collapse is just about violence and destruction. But sometimes what kills a society is the slow loss of what made it special. The big projects stop. The festivals end. The sense of safety disappears. People start to focus only on survival. That's what systems collapse looks like from the inside. Now, let's look at another example. Egypt. Egypt survived the collapse, but just barely. For hundreds of years, Egypt was the most powerful kingdom around. It had food, gold, and armies, but even Egypt depended on the larger system. When its trading partners vanished, Egypt lost supplies of wood, copper, and even horses. Grain shipments stopped. The cost of defending the borders went up. The pharaohs had to spend more money on soldiers and less on temples and art. We have records from Egypt during these years. There are complaints about shortages, letters from officials begging for supplies, priests writing to the pharaoh asking for grain to feed temple workers. In one famous case, workers on a royal ship, Al-Tum, went on strike because they hadn't been paid in weeks. The food ran out. The workers sat down and refused to move until someone brought bread. Imagine that, a strike in ancient times because the system had broken down that badly. Here's another detail. In the years after the collapse, Egyptian art and writing changed. The grand style of the old days disappeared. Temples were smaller, simpler. Tombs were left unfinished. Even the way people wrote changed. Shorter messages, less flowery language. It was like the whole culture took a breath and shrank just to survive. So what caused this system's collapse? Was it bad weather, war, disease? The answer is yes to all of it. Any one of these problems could be handled if it came alone. But when they came together, the system couldn't take the strain. A bad harvest meant less food, which meant weaker soldiers, which made it easier for raiders to attack. Raiders destroyed trade routes, which meant less copper, which meant fewer weapons, which made it harder to defend cities. On and on it went, each problem making the others worse. It's like a web. Cut one thread and the rest hold. Cut too many and the whole thing falls apart. Let's take it. Look about another angle. Leadership. When times are good, leaders look strong. They build monuments, throw big festivals, and keep the peace. But in a crisis, their job is much harder. They have to solve problems quickly. They have to keep people calm. They have to feed the hungry, repair damage, and stop fights before they turn into riots. In a system's collapse, there are too many problems and not enough solutions. Leaders lose the trust of their people. Some are overthrown, some run away, some just disappear from history. In some places, we see signs of rebellion, burned palaces, broken statues of kings, graffiti scratched into temple walls. It's like people finally gave up on the old system and decided to start over. But there's no clear plan for what comes next. The new leaders are often just as lost as the old ones. Something else to think about: migration. When the system breaks, people move. They leave their homes looking for safer ground, better land, or just a chance to survive. In the years when the old world collapsed, there were waves of people on the move. Some were pushed out by drought or hunger. Others ran from war or earthquake. They mixed with new groups, brought tea, their own skills and stories, and sometimes clashed with the people already living there. This mixing changed everything. Old languages faded. New styles of pottery and tools appeared. Some gods were forgotten. Others became more important. You can see this in the ruins. A layer of old familiar things, and then suddenly something new and strange on top. And then there's the loss of memory. When writing disappears, when cities are left empty, it's easy for people to forget what came before. In some places, even the names of old kings and cities vanished. People made up new stories to explain the ruins they saw. Legends grew up about lost heroes, vanished palaces, and gods who turned away. It's tempting to look for a single cause, one big disaster that explains everything. But real history is messier than that. It's 1,000 small cracks, not one big break. The system was strong, but it wasn't flexible. When things went wrong, it couldn't bend. It snapped. What fascinates me about this is how modern it feels. We like to think the past was simple, but these people lived in a world full of connections, deals, and risks. Their lives depended on things they couldn't always see or control. When the system worked, it felt safe and rich. When it failed, there was nowhere to turn. So, what can we learn from a collapse like this? Maybe it's that complexity is both a strength and a weakness. A system that connects everyone can make life better, but it can also spread disaster farther and faster. Sometimes being connected means sharing risk as well as reward. You might wonder if anyone saw this coming. It's hard to say. Maybe some did. Maybe there were warnings, letters not answered, shipments that never arrived, rumors of trouble from traveling merchants. But when the system is all you've ever known, it's hard to imagine it ending. There's one more thing. After the collapse, the survivors didn't just sit in the ruins. They built new lives. They learned new ways to farm, to fight, to trade. They made new alliances. Some started using iron instead of bronze because it was easier to find and didn't depend on faraway mines. Slowly, new cities grew up. New cultures formed. The world didn't end. It just changed. That's the lesson. Maybe collapse isn't always the end. It's a turning point. Something breaks and something new begins. The old world with its palaces and trade route, it was gone. But out of the ruins, new people rose up. They carried the memory of what was lost and the hope of building something better. If you look at history, you see this pattern again and again. Rise, fall, rebuild. Each time the details are different, but the shape is the same. People adapt. They hold on to what they have, let go of what they can't save, and try to make sense of the world around them. So, was it war? Was it hunger? Was it nature, or bad luck, or just the way things had to go? The truth is, it was all of those things mixed together, feeding off each other. The system that made the ancient world rich and powerful was also what made it fragile. And, when enough pieces fell out, the whole thing came down. No single theory explains everything. The truth is, we still don't fully know. After the old world came crashing down, most people didn't write about it. They didn't leave books or letters to tell us how they survived. What we have are clues. Broken pots, ruined walls, a few names scratched into stone. But from these scraps, we can piece together a picture of what happened to the survivors. It isn't always a pretty story, but it's the start of something new. Let starts in Greece. After the palaces burned and the cities shrank, life changed completely. Imagine living in a place like Mycenaeans, where your grandparents once saw parades of chariots and feasts for hundreds. Now, the palace is a blackened shell. The big halls where the king once sat are empty. People move into smaller houses. They use stones from the old walls to build new shelters. Instead of grand tombs, they bury their dead in simple graves, sometimes just in the dirt outside the ruins. The number of people drops fast. Archaeologists have counted the houses. In some towns, there are only a handful left after the collapse. It's not just that people died. Many left. Maybe they searched for better land, or maybe they were driven out by hunger or fear. The countryside fills up with small villages. Life becomes local again. You know your neighbors, and that's about it. The days of kings writing to each other across the sea are over. What about food? Before, farmers grew more than they needed. They could store grain for years, trade for things they didn't have, and feed workers building palaces or temples. Now it's different. The fields are smaller. People farm just enough to survive. There's less wheat, more barley and lentils, crops that grow even when the weather is bad. The pots they use for cooking are plain and sturdy, not painted or fancy. When you're worried about making it through the winter, you don't care much about decorations. Pottery is a great clue. Before the collapse, Greek pottery was known for its shapes and painted scenes. After the style changes, it gets simpler, rougher, almost rushed. For a while, there's hardly any pottery at all. Some people even stop making their own and just reuse old pieces. Later, a new style appears called proto-geometric. It's all straight lines and basic shapes. No more images of gods or heroes. You can see the change happen in layers of dirt, one on top of the other. Writing disappears for hundreds of years in Greece. The old script called Linear B vanishes. People forget how to read and write. No more records, no more letters, no more lists of goods traded or taxes owed. For the next 400 years, there's nothing written down. This gap is so deep that later Greeks didn't even know who built the ruins around them. They made up myths about giants and lost golden ages to explain what they saw. It's easy to think something just fell apart, but that's not the whole story. People adapted. They learned to use what was left. Some found new ways to live. There's evidence of iron tools appearing in Greece after the collapse. Iron was harder to work than bronze, but you could find iron ore in more places. You didn't need distant mines or long trade routes. It was a game changer. Slowly, iron tools and weapons spread. They weren't fancy at first, just small knives and simple farming gear, but over time they got better. This little shift set the stage for the next age. Now let's look at the eastern Mediterranean coast. Places like Uga and Byblo had been rich trading cities. After the destruction, some of them disappeared for good. Others shrank to tiny villages. The ruins show people moving into what was left, living in old storerooms, patching up walls with mud and branches. Sometimes new groups arrived. They settled among the ruins, bringing their own customs and pottery styles. You see this in the layers, old local pots. Then suddenly new shapes and decorations, as if someone new had moved in. In the south, the survivors included the people who had become the Philistines. They settled along the coast, Saint, building new towns on top of the ruins. Their pottery looked different, more like what you'd find in the Aon than in Canaan. It's not just pots, either. The layout of their houses, the way they cooked, even the food they ate was a mix of local and foreign. They kept pigs, which most of their neighbors didn't. Over time, they blended in, but you can trace the change in the ground. Egypt, as we talked about, didn't fall completely, but it changed. The pharaohs kept power in name, but everything was harder. The great temples weren't finished. The tombs grew smaller and less decorated. There were strikes and shortages. Ordinary people had to make do with less. Even the language changed. Fewer big words, more simple messages. The country became more inward-looking, more focused on survival than on building or conquering. In the north, the Assyrians watched from a distance. Their kingdom didn't collapse, but it went quiet for a while. Some cities shrank, others became fortresses. When things finally settled down, the Assyrians grew strong again. They learned from what happened. They built tougher walls, trained bigger armies, and made sure their supply lines were secure. In a way, the collapse was a warning, one they didn't forget. Let's talk about daily life for the survivors. Imagine being a child born just after the collapse. Your parents remember grand processions and crowded markets. You grow up in a world of ruins. You play in the broken courts of a palace, never knowing what it once was. The adults tell stories about the old days, but you can't picture them. Your world is smaller and quieter. Most people work the land. There are no big construction projects, no new temples or palaces. If you're lucky, you live near a spring or a river. You plant barley, keep a goat or two, maybe trade with a neighbor for cheese or wool. When trouble comes, raiders, bad weather, sickness, there's nowhere to turn for help. You rely on family and friends. The sense of being part of something bigger is faded, but not all is lost. People still sing songs and tell stories. Some old tradition survives, passed down by word of mouth. Maybe a festival in spring or a harvest dance in autumn. The gods are still there, but maybe their names and faces are changing. With fewer priests and temples, religion becomes more personal. Small shrines pop up in homes or fields. People leave off earrings of bread or oil, hoping for good luck. There's also evidence of people coming together for safety. Some villages build new walls, not as big as before, but enough to keep out wild animals or thieves. People dig wells or pools to store water in dry years. They learn to hide food or tools in case of trouble. In some places, you see new leaders rise, not kings, but strong men or women who can organize defenses or settle arguments. Trade never disappears completely, but it shrinks. Instead of ships crossing the sea, you get small-scale swapping, maybe a pot for a goat or salt for grain. When someone shows up with metal for sale, it's a big event. Over time, as things settle, trade grows again, but it's nothing like before. Let's look at Cyprus for a moment. The island was once rich from copper. After the collapse, production drops fast. The big towns shrink. People move inland, maybe for safety. The style of pottery changes. There's less of the fine-painted ware, more plain and practical pieces. Eventually, new people arrive, traders and settlers from the mainland. They bring different ways of working metal and building houses. Cyprus becomes a crossroads again, but it takes time. Now, think about writing. In most places, it vanishes, but not everywhere. In the East, the Phoenicians keep writing. They use a new alphabet simpler than the old scripts. It's easy to learn. This alphabet spreads slowly, carried by traders. It's the ancestor of the Greek and Roman alphabets. Out of the silence of the collapse, something new and lasting is born. Let's zoom out for a second. If you walked the land 100 years after the fall, what would you see? Scattered villages, some built inside old city walls, ruined palaces half buried by dirt and grass, fields of barley and emmer wheat, a few sheep grazing nearby, smoke from small fires, children playing among broken columns. Life goes on, but it's quieter, slower, less connected to the wide world. Sometimes new groups move in. Migrations didn't stop with the sea peoples. Over the next few centuries, waves of people arrive from the north and east. Some are looking for new land to farm. Others are fleeing trouble somewhere else. They bring new languages, tools, and beliefs. The old world becomes a patchwork of different peoples, each with their own ways. Let's look at Anatolia, the land once ruled by the Hittites. After their cities empty out, smaller kingdoms pop up. Some are run by local chiefs, others by newcomers. The pottery changes. The writing disappears, then returns in new forms. Old gods are forgotten or their names are changed. The land is divided but not empty. Over time, new towns form where the land is good or the rivers run strong. It's easy to forget the survivors were real people, not just names on a timeline. Some became refugees, walking for days to find a new home. Others stayed trying to rebuild with what little they had. Some probably turned to banditry, stealing to survive. Others tried to keep old traditions alive. Most were just ordinary people doing their best to get by. Disease may have played a part in the chaos. In times of hunger or war, sickness spreads quickly. If you're living in crowded ruins or moving from place to place, you have less food, less clean water, less safety. There are no ancient texts describing plagues in detail, but bones found in graves sometimes show signs of illness, especially among children. What about old knowledge, When writing and schools disappear, people forget things. How to build a stone arch, how to mix bronze, how to read or write. Skills, passed from master to apprentice, are lost if there's nobody left to teach. But some knowledge survives in stories or habits, ways to farm, simple remedies, tricks for finding water. In a way, the survivors become the bridge between the old world and what comes next. Over time, new leaders appear. Not the gods' kings of old, but local chiefs or warlords. In some places, the survivors form councils, groups of elders who decide when to plant or how to defend the village. Power is smaller, more personal. There's no more distant king to send orders. And slowly things begin to change. As the years pass, people start to trade again. They build small ships, risk short trips along the coast. Iron tools become more common. Pottery styles grow more complex. People start to carve simple decorations again. Maybe it's a sign of hope, a way of saying that life is more than just surviving. In the West, the Greeks eventually develop a new way of organizing themselves, small city-states, each with its own rules and leaders. In the East, the Phoenicians sail out, founding new cities and trading posts. In the North, the Assyrians grow strong, building an empire that learns from the mistakes of the past. Taught, here's what fascinates me about this part of the story. Out of ruins and silence, something new always grows. People don't just sit in the ashes, they adapt. They make new tools, learn new ways, and build new lives. The old world is gone, but its memory shapes what comes next. Even the legends that come later, the stories of lost cities, wandering heroes, and golden ages come from this time. When the Greeks told tales of Troy or Atlantis, they were trying to make sense of the ruins and the gaps in their own history. The survivors didn't know they were starting a new era. They were just getting through each day. Now, if you look at the land today, you see the layers buried under modern cities and towns are the remains of those early survivors. Each layer is a story told in broken bricks, worn tools, and faded bones. It's a reminder that after every collapse, there's a beginning. So, what happened to the survivors? They learned to live in a smaller world. They let go of things they couldn't keep, big palaces, distant trade, even writing for a while. But they held on to what mattered: family, skill, memory, hope that the future might be better. History doesn't move in straight lines. Sometimes it jumps backward, then forward again. The people who made it through the collapse didn't know they were part of a bigger story. But they were. They were the link between what was lost and what would someday return. And that's how the world changed, not with a single event, but with thousands of small choices by people we'll never know. Choices to stay or leave, to share or fight, to remember or forget. The old world was gone, but the seeds of a new world were already growing in its place. When you trace the path from those survivors to the later Greeks, you see something strange. The people who rebuilt didn't remember the old world clearly. They had to start over, almost from scratch. But in the end, that's what survival means. Not just holding on, but learning how to begin again. We've talked about the survivors. Now, let's look at something stranger. The way memories of what happened turned into stories, then legends, then myths. This part is where history starts to blur. People didn't just forget facts. They turned the past into something bigger, weirder, and sometimes more magical than what really happened. Picture a family living in the shadow of broken walls, the grade. And parents might remember the old days, kings, palaces, crowded markets, but the children don't. All they see are ruins. To them, those fallen stones could be anything. Maybe they belonged to giants. Maybe gods lived there. Maybe the world before was different in ways nobody can really explain. That's the heart of this mystery. When writing disappears and nobody can read the old records, stories have to fill the gap. People pass down memories, but each time they do, the story changes a little. What started as a real event, a war, a famine, a fire, becomes a tale. Then, as years go by, it turns into a Hearn's legend. Let's take the Greeks. By the time they started writing again, hundreds of years had passed since the fall. They didn't know who built the ruins they saw every day. They made up stories about heroes and monsters, the wolves of Mycenaeans. Later, Greeks said they were built by cyclopes, giant beings with a single eye. Why? Because the stones were so huge that no normal person could have moved them. The same thing happened with Troy. For a long time, people thought Troy was just a legend from Homer's poems. The story of the Trojan War, with its wooden horse and angry gods, was too LD for hundreds of years before anyone found the real city buried under layers of dirt. When archaeologists dug it up in the 1800s, they found proof that a big city really did exist there, and it really was destroyed around the same time as the other collapses. The story wasn't completely made up, but it wasn't all true either, and it's not just Greece. Across the Old World, you find stories about lost golden ages. In Egypt, later generations told tales of a time when gods walked among men, when the Nile flowed with endless water, and when kings ruled in perfect peace. They looked back at the ruins and imagined a world better than the one they lived in. In the Levant, old tales speak of mighty cities swallowed by the earth. Some say these were punished by the gods, others say they were destroyed for secrets or sins lost to time. Each group had its own version. The truth was gone, but the feeling stayed. The sense that something great had been lost and nobody knew how to get it back. Now, let's look at how myths can start with simple facts. Imagine a drought so bad that whole towns are abandoned. People leave their homes, searching for food and water. Years later, the empty villages are overgrown. Someone finds a pot, a broken statue, or a burnt wall. They ask, who lived here? What happened? Nobody really knows, so they guess. Maybe the gods were angry. Maybe a monster came in the night. Maybe there was a war that nobody remembers. These guesses become stories. The stories become traditions. Before you know it, a real disaster becomes a legend about a city cursed by the gods or a hero defending his people from an enemy nobody can name. And as the years pass, the line between memory and myth disappears. One of the strangest things is how much later cultures tried to explain the ruins around them. In Greece, people saw the great walls and broken columns and built new stories to fit what they saw. They invented heroes: Hercules, Perseus, Theseus, who could do things normal people couldn't. If a wall was too big to build, it must have been made by someone superhuman. This isn't just about making things up, it's about trying to make sense of a world that doesn't match what you see every day. If you live in a small village, but walk past the ruins of a giant palace, it's hard to believe your ancestors were just like you. So you imagine they were different, taller, stronger, closer to the gods. It's a way of dealing with the mystery of the past. The story of Atlantis comes from this same place. Plato wrote about a lost city swallowed by the sea, a place of wonders that vanished overnight. He was writing much later, but the idea of a world lost to disaster was already old by then. Maybe he heard rumors or old tales passed down for centuries. Maybe he just made it up, but the feeling is real. The sense that something big was lost, and we're all living in the shadow of that loss. There's also the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest stories ever written down. In the tale, a great flood wipes out the world. Only one man and his family survive by building a boat. Sound familiar? This is centuries before the Bible story of Noah. Floods really did happen in Mesopotamia. The land between the rivers flooded often, killing crops, and forcing people to move. Over time, the memory of these disasters turned into stories about the end of the world and the rebirth of life. You see this pattern everywhere. Real events, wars, famines, plagues, earthquakes become the seed for stories that grow bigger with each telling. Sometimes people remember a name or a plaque, we'll see. Other times only the feeling remains, the fear, the hope, the longing for what was lost. Now, here's something that always gets me. The farther you get from the actual events, the more fantastic the stories become. What was once a war between cities becomes a battle between gods. A drought becomes a curse. A migration becomes a journey led by a hero who talks to animals or fights monsters. And yet, if you dig deep enough, you can sometimes find the truth hiding under the myth. Scientists have studied the layers of dirt in Greece and Turkey. They found ash from fires, bones from battles, and even pollen that shows when the climate changed. These are the facts buried under the stories. But for the people living after the collapse, facts didn't matter as much as meaning. They wanted to know why things changed. Why did the gods let their cities fall? Why did their ancestors lose everything? Myths gave them answers, even if those answers weren't true in a historical sense. It's not just about explaining the past, though. Myths also help people cope with the present. When you're living in hard times, it's comforting to think that things were once better or that heroes might return so. Mede. The idea of a lost golden age gives people hope, even if it's just a story. Let's talk about memory on a smaller scale. Inside families, villages, and small towns, when official records are gone, people rely on old songs, tales, and habits. Maybe a grandmother remembers a special way to bake bread, a story about a king, or a song sung at harvest. Each time she tells it, the details shift. Over generations, the story changes so much that nobody knows what the original was. Sometimes stories from different places get mixed together. A tale from Egypt finds its way to Greece. A story from Anatolia ends up in a Hebrew family's evening prayers. Trade and migration help mix everything up. So myths spread far beyond their original homes. This is how legends grow. They pick up new details, lose old ones, and blend with other tales. That's why so many cultures have stories about floods, lost cities, wandering heroes, and wise kings. They all start with something real, but they end up as something bigger. There's another side to this, the way myths shape the future. When the Greeks rebuilt their cities, they used the legends as blueprints. They named their streets and temples after him, rose from the old stories. Festivals celebrated events that probably never happened but felt true anyway. Myths helped people know who they were even when their real history was lost. The same thing happened in other places. In Israel, stories of Moses and Joshua gave people a sense of purpose. In Egypt, tales of Osiris and Isis made sense of death and rebirth. In each case, myths filled the silence left by lost records. Now, let's pause and think about what it means to lose memory this way. When writing vanishes, when cities fall, when teachers and storytellers disappear, a culture loses more than facts. It loses part of itself. The old ways of building, farming, healing, and worshipping can vanish in a single generation if nobody remembers to pass them on. But people don't just accept that. They fight back in the only way they can by telling stories. A story is easier to remember than a list of dates or names. You can sing it, act it out, or share it around a fire. Even if the details change, the feeling survives. There's something almost magical about this. Even after the darkest times, people find ways to keep the past alive. Not always correctly, and not always clearly, but enough to give meaning to their lives. Even now, we're still haunted by these old stories. They shape our books, movies, and even our dreams. So, what does the evidence actually show? Archaeologists dig up layers of ruins and find objects with no names. Sometimes they find a strange idol, a bronze sword, or a pot with symbols nobody can read. They guess at what these things meant, but they can't be sure. The people who made them are long gone, and their language is lost. But now and then, there's a breakthrough. Someone cracks an old code. Like when scholars finally read Linear B. Suddenly, a forgotten world comes back to life. Lists of sheep, jars of oil, names of people long dead. But most scripts from this time are still silent. And even when writing returns, it doesn't always tell the truth. The first stories written down after the collapse are already mixed with legend. The Iliad and the Odyssey are the best examples. They're poems about the past, but they're full of talking gods, magic armor, and impossible feats. They're not history, but they're not pure fantasy either, somewhere in the middle. The same goes for other cultures. The Bible's tales of Moses, the walls of Jericho, and the wanderings in the desert echo real events, but they're wrapped in miracle and mystery. Egyptian records mix fact with magic, prayers with law. What fascinates me about this is how much we rely on these stories. Even now, our ideas about heroes, justice and fate come from myths that started as half-remembered facts. Even when the truth is buried, the stories live on. Every time a city falls, every time a culture changes, something like this happens. Memory fades, facts become stories, stories become legends, and legends shape the way the next generation sees the world. That's how memory turns into myth. It's not a straight line, it's a spiral, each turn adding something new, each layer covering what came before. We'll never recover everything that was lost, but by digging, reading, and dreaming, we get glimpses. Sometimes that's enough. So when you hear a story about a lost city, a wandering hero, or a golden age, remember that it might be someone's memory, twisted by time, but still true at its core. That's the real magic of history. Not just what happened, but how we remember it, and what we do with those memories as we build our own stories. So, why does any of this matter? Why should we care about a bunch of lost cities and broken walls from over 3,000 years ago? Most days, it feels far away, like something that happened on another planet. But here's the thing. The collapse in 1177 BC changed the world in ways that still reach us today. We don't always see it, but it's there, shaping the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. First, let's talk about the idea of collapse itself. Most people think of history as a straight line, one invention after another, always getting better. But that's not how it works. Sometimes things fall apart. They don't just bounce back. When the old world ended, it didn't come back the way it was. People had to start over. That fact alone changes how we should see our own world. Why? Because it shows how fragile things can be. Back then, people thought their cities would last forever. Their kings built palaces, traded with neighbors, wrote letters about gold statues and marriage alliances, but none of that saved them when the big shocks hit. The lesson: even the strongest systems can break if too many things go wrong at once. Here's another angle. The collapse didn't just end one world, it made space for new things to grow. The chaos wasn't just destruction, it was also a reset. Without the old kings and their rules, new ideas had a chance. New leaders could rise. Small groups could make their own choices. Sometimes smaller is stronger. Greece after the fall. For hundreds of years, it was just villages and small towns. No big palaces, no kings ruling over everything. But out of that darkness, something new grew. Ideas about democracy, philosophy, and science. None of that would have happened if the old system hadn't crashed. Sometimes, you need the silence before you can hear a new song. Think about Egypt, too. The empire almost ended. The pharaohs lost most of their power, but the country survived. It got smaller, but it lasted. The priests kept old traditions alive. They copied ancient texts. They rebuilt temples, even if they were smaller than before. Egypt became a bridge, a place where the old world and the new could meet. Without the collapse, maybe that mix never happens. Now, let's look at trade. Before 1177 BC, trade networks tied everything together. Copper from Cyprus, tin from faraway mountains, gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon. When the system worked, everyone got richer. But when it broke, people had to find new ways to get what they needed. Some places learned to live with less, others found new partners. This forced people to become creative. They had to adapt, invent, or go hungry. Why does the matter to us? Because our own world is connected in similar ways. We depend on long chains of supply for food, energy, and technology. Seeing how quickly those old networks fell apart can make you stop and think. It reminds us not to take stability for granted. There's also the question of memory. When the old world vanished, most people couldn't read or write. The few who could were either killed, scattered, or forced to start over. So much knowledge was lost. How to build certain kinds of ships, how to write certain scripts, even recipes for bronze metal work disappeared. It took generations for people to relearn these things. This shows how easy it is to lose knowledge. It doesn't disappear all at once. It fades piece by piece as people forget, or as the last person who knows a skill dies. That's why the collapse is more than just ruins. It's a warning. Cultures don't just lose buildings. They lose ways of thinking, making, and believing. Here's where it gets interesting. Sometimes what survives isn't the big stuff. It's the small things. A song, a way to bake bread, a story about a hero or a monster. These are the seeds that grow new worlds. They're easy to carry, easy to remove, ember and hard to kill. That's why even after the old world ended, people still found ways to build meaning out of what was left. Now, let's talk about fear and hope. The people who lived through the collapse didn't know why everything was happening. They just knew that their world was falling apart. That kind of fear sticks around. It shapes how people act, how they tell stories, even how they raise their children. For centuries, later generations looked back at the ruins and saw a warning. Things can fall apart even when you think they're safe, but there's hope, too. Out of the ashes, people found new ways to live. They planted new crops. They moved to new lands. They made new alliances. The collapse forced people to change, but it didn't end the story. That's important. Disaster isn't the end. It's just a turning point. Let's get more specific. When writing faded away, so did the ability to control history. Before kings wrote about their victories and covered up their defeats after the collapse, nobody could spin the story. Nobody could erase the past. This opened the door for new voices. The stories that survived came from all kinds of people, not just rulers. Old songs, pray, RS and family tales became the backbone of new cultures. Why does that matter? Because it shows that history isn't just what gets written down. It's also what gets remembered, sung, or whispered before bed. Sometimes the most important things aren't found in great books or carved on stone. They're in the memories of regular people. Another thing that matters is how people explain disaster. After the collapse, people didn't just shrug and move on. They needed reasons. Some blamed angry gods. Others pointed to curses or mistakes. These explanations shaped new religions, laws, and even politics. If you believe disaster comes from angering the gods, you act one way. If you think it's just bad luck, you act another. Over time, these beliefs became traditions. They shaped how people responded to new threats. They changed how people built cities, how they prayed, and how they treated strangers. The collapse didn't just change the map, it changed people's minds. Now, let's look at technology. When the old world fell, some skills vanished. Making bronze required tin and copper from far away. When trade stopped, so did bronze. People had to learn to use iron, which was harder to work, but often common. This shift was huge. Took time, but it allowed new societies to rise. Iron, tools, and weapons made farming and fighting different. Over time, this helped shape the world that followed. Sometimes progress comes not from getting better at something, but from being forced to try something new. If the old way still worked, maybe nobody would have bothered with iron. The collapse pushed people out of their comfort zones. There's also a lesson about connection and independence. When the world was tightly linked, everyone depended on everyone else. That made life rich and interesting, but it also made people vulnerable. When the system broke, those who could adapt survived. They learned to rely on local resources. They built stronger communities. They found new ways to trade and share. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Connection is powerful, but so is the ability to stand on your own when you have to. Balance is key. Too much of either can lead to trouble. Let's talk about power. Before the collapse, kings and queens ruled over huge territories. They made big decisions, ran armies, and collected taxes. When the old world ended, most of that power disappeared. Local leaders took over. Some places became more equal with decisions made by groups instead of one person. In other places, strong warriors or priests took charge. This shift didn't happen overnight. It took years, even generations, but it changed the way people thought about leadership. Some of the earliest ideas about freedom, citizenship, and rights grew out of this time of chaos. The old ways were gone, so people had to invent new ones. Think about art and culture. When the palaces fell, the fancy art stopped. No more gold jewelry or giant wall paintings. But people didn't stop making things. They just made different things. Pottery became simpler and more useful. Songs and stories became more important since they were easier to share and remember. This is the time when many of the oldest myths and legends took shape. Sometimes less is more. When you're not focused on impressing a king, you can make things that matter to you and your neighbors. Art becomes personal. Stories become tools for survival. There's also a lesson about forgetting. When writing vanished, so did a lot of history. For hundreds of years, nobody could read old texts. Even when writing came back, the new scripts were different. Much of what was known before stayed lost. This reminds us that memory is fragile. If you want something to last, you have to pass it on again and again. Now, let's touch on science. Some of the oldest science was lost during the collapse. Recipes for medicine, knowledge of the stars, even simple farming tricks disappeared. Later generations had to figure things out all over again. Sometimes it took hundreds of years to get back to where people had once been. This shows that progress isn't guaranteed. It's easy to think that once something is invented, it will stay. But that's not true. If the people who know something are gone, the knowledge can vanish too. But here's what really fascinates me. Even after everything fell apart, the urge to wonder, to question, to learn never went away. People still looked at the sky and tried to understand it. They still asked why the world worked the way it did. That spark survived even when almost everything else was lost. Let's look at how the collapse changed religion. After the disaster, new gods appeared. Old ones faded. People needed answers. So they invented new rituals, new prayers, new stories about where they came from and what their lives meant. Some of these ideas spread far and wide, becoming the roots of later religions. The collapse created space for new beliefs to grow. That's another reason this matters, because it shows how new ways of believing can rise from disaster. Crisis forces people to search for meaning. Sometimes those new meanings last for thousands of years. Now let's talk about the way the collapse shaped the world map. Old borders disappeared. New ones took their place. Some people moved far from their homes. Others stayed and rebuilt on top of the ruins. The world got smaller in some ways, but also more varied. Each region developed its own style, its own rules, its own way of life. This is when the seeds of the later countries were planted. So even though everything seemed to end, something new was always beginning. That's why this story matters. Not because it was a tragedy, but because it was a turning point. There's one more thing. The collapse reminds us that nothing lasts forever. Even the biggest empires, the richest cities, the smartest leaders, none of them are safe from change. But it also shows that people are tough. They mourn, they remember, and then they start again. That's how history moves forward. So when you hear about lost worlds, fallen cities, and vanished cultures, remember that their story isn't just about loss, it's about what comes after. It's about how people find ways to survive, to rebuild, to dream again. Even when the lights go out, someone always finds a way to light a new fire. And that's why this story is still important. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, there's always a way through. The past isn't just gone. It's part of who we are. The ruins, the legends, the memories, they're all pieces of the same puzzle. We're still putting it together, even now. So, next time you walk past a broken wall or hear an old story, think about the people who came before. Think about what they lost, but also what they found. In the end, that's what matters most. Not the fall, but the rise that comes after. Now, let the story rest. Let yourself rest. So, here we are, with the ancient world in pieces. It's quiet now. The fires have burned out. The palaces are empty. And the survivors are trying to pick up what's left. But the story doesn't just end with ruins and silence. There's something else here. A question that hangs in the dark after the collapse. What can we learn from a world that almost disappeared overnight? Start with this. Most of what people built did not last. The great stone walls fell. The gold was stolen, melted down, or buried and forgotten. Even the written words pressed into clay or painted on papyrus crumbled or faded away. Almost everything that seemed permanent turned out to be fragile. That's a strange thought, isn't it? It makes you wonder what from our own world would survive if everything stopped tomorrow. But not everything was lost. Some things slipped through the cracks, hidden in small places, waiting for someone to find them again. Clay tablets buried in the dirt, tools left in abandoned fields, odd bits of jewelry tucked away in tombs. These scraps are how we know anything about 1177 BC at all. They let us peek through a keyhole into a vanished world. It's easy to look at the fall and only see darkness. There's another side, though. The end of one thing makes room for something new. The collapse set off a chain of changes that no one planned. People who lost everything had to figure out how to survive. They didn't have a blueprint. They tried things. Some worked, some didn't. The West world shrank, then slowly grew again in new directions. Let's think about the people left behind. The kings and generals are gone. But most people were never rulers. They were farmers, potters, shepherds, carpenters. When the big systems fell, everyday life became both harder and simpler. There were fewer choices, but also fewer rules. You grew food, fixed what you could, and kept your family safe. The world was smaller, but maybe you knew it better. Imagine a young woman in a village built on top of old ruins. She's never seen a palace. She's heard stories from her grandmother about golden days, but her world is different. Her life is shaped by what's close at hand. The river, the fields, the changing sky. She makes bread the same way her ancestors did, but the songs she sings at night are new. They're about hope, fear, and starting again. Think about the children born after the fall. For them, the past is a rumor. The ruins are just part of the landscape. They grow up hearing strange tales about giants or gods who shape the world. They don't know those stories are twisted memories of real events. Their world is fresh, but built from the pieces of something old. Here's something interesting. People are good at filling gaps. When there's no clear answer, we make one up. That's how legends are born. The missing years turn into myths. The stories help people make sense of things they can't explain. Sometimes those stories hold a kind of truth, not about what happened, but about how it felt to live through the end of an age. Now, let's talk about change. After the collapse, the world didn't bounce back, it shifted. People moved to new lands. They learned new tricks, how to work iron, how to build with less. Some ideas faded, but others took their place. The world didn't get better or worse. It just became different. That's what makes this story so powerful. It's not about losing everything. It's about learning to live in a world that won't stop changing. If you look closely, you can see echoes of this long night in other times and places. The fall of Rome, the end of the Mayan cities, even smaller disasters like towns wiped out by flood or fire. Each time people face the same challenge. How do you start again when so much is gone? The answer is never simple, but it always begins with the small things. A seed saved for planting, a story told by the fire, a tool passed down from parent to child. There's a kind of comfort in that. Even when the big plans fall apart, people find a way. They learn to trust the seasons, to listen to each other, to build again with what they have. The world keeps moving, even if it takes a different shape each time. Let's pause a moment and think about what it would be like to live through that long night. You wake up one morning and everything you thought was safe is gone. The city walls are broken. The roads are empty. The markets are silent, but the sun still rises. The river still flows. People gather, share what food they have, and find new ways to get by. It's not easy. There's grief, fear, and hunger, but there's also stubbornness. People hang on. Over time, the hard days become stories you tell your children. The pain softens. The memories blur. What once felt like the end of everything slowly turns into something else. A beginning you didn't choose, but a beginning all the same. Here's another thought. Maybe the most important thing that survives isn't buildings or riches. Maybe it's the ability to imagine something better, to look at broken walls and see not just loss, but a space to build again. So what people did after 1177 BC. They didn't have much, but they had each other. They had hope, even if it was small and quiet. That's often enough. There's something mysterious about how people keep going, even when the world falls apart. Maybe it's habit. Maybe it's hope. Maybe it's just the need to keep moving, to keep finding meaning in the everyday. Whatever the reason, the darkness doesn't last forever. Sooner or later, someone lights a lamp, sings a new song, plants a seed. That's how the world renews itself. Now, let's look forward. The world that came after the collapse was not the same as before. It was less grand, but in some ways, more open. Villages became the center of life. Small groups made their own rules. Slowly, over hundreds of years, new cultures grew up in the shadow of the old ones. Some things were forgotten, but others were invented. Iron tools, new ways of farming, fresh trade routes. The seeds of today's world were planted in the ashes of that long night. It's strange to realize that we live with the results of that collapse every day. The languages we speak, the stories we know, even the foods we eat. Some of it comes from choices made in that distant time. The old world ended, but it didn't vanish completely. It left fingerprints on everything that came after. Sometimes when you're standing in a museum or reading about the past, it's easy to feel cut off from people who lived so long ago. But if you strip away the kings and battles, what remains is familiar: hunger, hope, fear, love, the need to belong. Those things don't change no matter how many years pass. There's a gentle lesson in that. The world can end and begin again, not just once, but many times. Each time people face the darkness, find their way, and start over. The tools may change. The houses may look different, but the heart of the story stays the same. If you ever feel small or helpless when you think about history, remember this: you are part of the same chain. Your life is one link in a story that stretches back thousands of years. The things you do, what you build, what you share, what you remember, become part of the next world, just like those ancient survivors. Maybe that's what history is for. Not just to warn us or teach us, but to remind us that we belong to something bigger. That even in the darkest times, we're never truly alone. The past is always with us, in many ways we can't see, shaping the ground we walk on, and the dreams we chase. So when you hear about a world that fell in a single lifetime, don't just think of ruins and loss. Think of the quiet courage it takes to begin again. Think of the hands that cleared the rubble, the voices that shaped new songs, the minds that dreamed up new ways of living. Even now, as the world keeps changing, that spirit matters. We can't control everything, but we can choose how we face the unknown with care, with hope, with the same stubbornness that carried people through the long night so long ago. Now let the questions drift away. Let the old world rest in its silence. You are safe here. The story is done for tonight. The night may be long, but morning always comes.